Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure at heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And so on, and so on, and so on. Alrighty everyone, hello, and welcome back to my nonsense. And boy, is it some sharp nonsense today. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of paradox in Christianity and why Christianity is in itself a paradoxical, subversive religion, and why that's important for the Christian witch. I've talked about this in similar videos like Is the Word Christian Witch an Oxymoron, which you can always check out, but I really wanted to talk more specifically today about paradox, because it's a component of the religion that, because so many people don't seem to understand it, is creating, all the problems that we have right now. Hi? Yeah? Come on. Yes, hi, baby. Hi, baby. Oh, it's my good man. Are you being This is my pigeon, Belog. He's being an agent of chaos right now. Before we get into that, though, hello, my name is Sarah Strayson. I am a Christian witch, a writer, an educator, content creator, all that kind of stuff, and I'm specifically a writer of this book right here, which just got a, kind of text-to-speech audio version for those who like to listen on the go. But in essence, if you were sitting there saying, what? When it came to Christian witchcraft, completely understandable. This book is basically just kind of like a crash course in what the hell we're talking about. Goes over the Bible verses related to witchcraft and what they really mean. Goes over all kinds of fun, cultural history around it, right? So European folk magic, stuff like that, and all kinds of other stuff that's very helpful for people who always knew they were a bit on the mystical witchy side, never knew how to reconcile that with being Christian as well. If you haven't already, please do in fact go ahead, ring the bell, like the video, subscribe, and also, And if you are not new here, welcome back, and thank you so much for joining. And I'll remind all of you that no matter what, if you come see me on my Patreon, you can get these videos 2 weeks early and ad-free, so check it out. But now, when it comes to Christianity as a paradoxical and subversive religion, you've likely heard people say exactly that bottom line, right, from Matthew 5. You will be persecuted in my name kind of thing, right? A lot of Christians roll around with that verse kind of like tattooed to the back of their eyelids, and they use it to vindicate themselves whenever someone calls them out for being an asshole. You know what I'm talking about, right? Someone's gonna say something outlandishly shitty, hateful, and just like bad, and then when people say, hey, that's outlandish, shitty, and bad, those people are gonna be like, I knew this day would come. Jesus told me I'd be persecuted in his name. In reality, it's just like, no one wants to deal with people throwing around fucking homophobic slurs on the community fucking Facebook post. The thing about that, though, is that when we talk about persecution and why Jesus was persecuted, which is a very topical thing to come up to at the time of my filming this, which was a couple days before Good Friday, is that Jesus wasn't being persecuted for being an asshole to people. Jesus was being persecuted, in fact, for trying to help people not be an asshole to people. And that's because from the jump, Christianity has been a subversive religion. Christianity is a religion that took every single thing that people assumed, thought, and understood about religion, gods, everything else at the time, and flipped it on its head. In fact, I will always think about this one video I saw from a rabbi, which explains really how in Judaism, the concept of God, this extremely divine, ineffable, just supreme being, ever being encased in flesh, like a man, is just abhorrent to them. And I remember seeing that video and being like, this is an interesting point, but in defense of Christianity, that kind of is the point, right? It is like unthinkable and even possibly disgusting to imagine a supreme being like God being stuck in these sacks full of blood and pus and shit and everything else. It's crazy, right? But that's kind of the point. Christianity is one institution where God reminds us that every image and idea we attach to God is in itself an illusion. And then when we start thinking of God in only one way, we actually get farther from him because we forget that you cannot limit a limitless being. And in that frame of being, in Christianity, we see how God flips on its head the entire social conventions of the time. This is really where things get a little bit dicey with people who want to claim that they're being persecuted in the name of Jesus, even though they are the ones who in the gospel story would have been doing the persecuting. Even though they're the ones that today are doing the persecuting. In Christianity, we see many different phrases and ideas that are put out there that don't make any sense, that defy reason, and that just absolutely blow up any expectations of a religion that other people looking in might have. There are a few ones off the jump, right? The idea that St. Paul puts out in his letters, the idea that God's power is made perfect in weakness, as well as Jesus's continuous flipping of common idioms, phrases, and ideas, right? Like, you have heard that it said, an eye for an eye. Well, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, right? Basically, anytime Jesus says, you have heard it said that, he's about to say something that flips that on its head, right? So, when people are saying it's okay to get divorced, Jesus is like, no, that was an exception, right? Like, all these different things down the line that Jesus says, they work to subvert the social order of the time, because the social order of the time had gotten corrupted, because people were taking the absolute extent, like the absolute edge of the boundary of the law, all the way as far as they could, while still technically following the law, to do some shitty things, right? For instance, with the case of divorce, Jesus says, let no man divorce his wife, not because, you're locked in one and done forever, and that's how it always should be because I said so, but because people at the time, there was a certain sect of folks who thought that men could divorce their wife for any reason at all, which put women in serious danger, because if you're getting divorced, you no longer have a provider, you are out in the cold, you become one of the many, types of widows and orphans and those who are considered the lowest of society with nowhere to be, nowhere to go, and nothing to do. To protect against that, Jesus was saying, divorce is actually not great, and you shouldn't be able to just throw your wife away because the sky is blue. But this was subversive, because again, and this was a time where men could do whatever the fuck they wanted. No repercussions, right? Likewise, when Paul says stuff like, men love your wives as yourselves, that's not just like a no-brainer. That was radical and subversive for the time, in a culture where the Romans were saying that men should not get too attached to their wives because they're just women and you could basically throw a stone and find like 5 of them. From the get-go, Christianity has been a religion of subverting social expectations, of subverting what people consider the natural order, right? Of all these other things, of just upending social structures. And this isn't something unique to Christianity, truly, because it actually starts in Judaism with that, what we would call the Old Testament, right? Even going as far back as Exodus, actually, we find that these laws about how to properly keep slaves, which sounds crazy to the modern ear, these laws were actually insanely progressive and possibly even subversive. Because at the time, legal codes like the Code of Hammurabi were out there insisting that if you killed a slave, you just had to pay the master some coin. Because a slave, a human being, a slave, is actually not a human being. They're the equivalent of any other piece of property you might have. Enter now Exodus, where God is saying you can have slaves, but if you kill a slave, you're being put to death as well, because that slave is in fact still a person. That isn't just a piece of property. That is a human being. Again, what sounds really honestly bad to the modern ear, back then sounded bad because it was radical and progressive, if you can believe it. When we think of Christianity being paradoxical like that, right? Of, a God walking around in the flesh, of power being made perfect in weakness, of also symbols, right? Like Jesus on Palm Sunday riding in just on a colt with a, very basic clothes on, contrasting the festivities of the Roman Empire, where the local governor was coming in on a big chariot with all kinds of gold and glory and other kind of big fashion that people would go gather around to cheer for. There is a big point, a big purpose to that in Christianity, and that is to disrupt the status quo. In fact, I kind of started talking a little bit about this on the gram with a little bit of a photo set, but in essence, Christianity, being a paradoxical religion, means that the one thing that it's really trying to do is destroy a corrupt status quo. Every time that, some stuff like this happens, when we have these new laws put in, be it the Mosaic Law or all the way later with Jesus coming in and setting up a new law, it's working to tear down the ways in which humanity and humans' greed and hard-heartedness and other things have basically warped and co-opted the parameters of God's law. Specifically, to give an example, what I'm talking about, right, is with the Pharisees. Jesus spends a lot of time talking against the Pharisees and pointing out that they kind of suck. However, we have to give Pharisees credit where credit's due. They weren't out there necessarily trying to be corrupt. They were out there actually really following the general idea of the religion as it had been, right? Back in this time, it was thought that if bad things are happening to you and your nation, it's because you're fucking up tremendously in the way of the Lord. So these Pharisees, who were living in Judea, occupied by a foreign pagan power, the Roman Empire, they were sitting here thinking, okay, shit, in order to, stop this, clearly we must have lost God's good graces. We must now follow the law to the letter, perfectly, exactly. Because historically, that's what helped before. The only thing is, though, by doing that, they were more obsessed with, hitting the right steps than actually understanding the spirit of the law, which is the entire point of the gospel story. Jesus comes back and says, of course I'm going to eat with sinners and to tax collectors and all these other people. Of course I'm going to heal the sick and all these other things. Of course I'm going to, pick grain on the Sabbath and all these other things. Of course I'm going to do everything that has flown in the face of what we would consider good and proper in this Jewish society, because the point isn't to be perfect at following rules. The point is to understand the spirit of the rules. And that spirit is, as Jesus sums up the greatest commandment, love God, love one another. This is paradoxical. This is subversive, because inherently societies were organized by oppressive structures, patriarchal structures, structured institutions of slavery, all these other things that inherently devalued people based on immutable characteristics like gender and all these other things, and also just on circumstances, right? Like the bonds of slavery. These things are not done in the spirit of love. So Christianity as a religion comes and subverts it. It also is meant to shame those who think that earthly power means anything, right? Like in the example of Jesus, right, on that Palm Sunday story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem on a colt, all the palm leaves, people waving around, all of the coats being thrown down. Massive contrast from the ridiculously overexpensive fanfare of the Roman governor that would, around this festival time, be coming in on the other side of town. Time and time again, we see the way that Jesus talks and the way that God talks. We see that this God is one who really would rather hold up people who are not considered worthy by human standards, but are absolutely made worthy by God's standards, right? When we think about many times where the prophets were not necessarily people that the actual Israelites or anyone else would have considered for God's prophecies, but that God handpicked himself, right? We see that there. We also see, even in the story of Jesus, when Jesus is going around being like, yep, I'm the dude, I'm the guy, and people are like, isn't this just the son of that, poor-ass carpenter from fucking Galilee? Who the hell is this guy, right? That common platitude comes to mind. God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called, right? This is intentional. All of this is to make a point that people continuously miss over and over and over again, and that is that everything we consider correct and righteous and true, which we then use in order to justify persecuting other people we consider less good, less true, and less proper, is something that God actively seeks and uses to humble people. Paul says various times in this language of paradox, he says things like, again, power is made perfect in weakness, but also that God uses the foolish to shame the wise. God uses the weak to shame the strong, right? God goes out of his way to subvert people's expectations, to throw them back in people's face. And for the Christian witch, that's important because, as we say in Discovering Christian Witchcraft, not only does God use the foolish to shame the wise and the weak to shame the strong, he's also now in this era using the witch to shame the priest. And what that means is the witch, this symbol of all things wicked, selfish, greedy, destructive, terrible, is now being used to highlight the ways in which Christians do exactly that in this era. Unfortunately for Christians, especially mainstream Christians, this whole concept that the gospel goes over, where the perfect following of the rules really does not matter so much as love, has kind of been lost on them, unfortunately. And in this little photo set I was making on Instagram, I was making a very simple point, right? When I'm talking about what it means to submit to or rebel against God, really, again, it comes back to those main principles. People have a tendency to get blinded by rules, as if perfectly following the rules is something that guarantees them God's favor and God's protection in the kingdom of heaven, despite the fact that parables like the prodigal son that Jesus tells tell us exactly the opposite. The prodigal son is one where, despite the fact that this son took his inheritance, ran away with it basically, and spent it all and screwed up bad, he still, when he went back to his father and said, forgive me, for doing that, the father still welcomed him in with open arms and showered him in all this love, while the other son, who had been dutifully standing by his father, doing everything exactly right, never disobeying his father ever, never got that same kind of fanfare and welcome back, right? It almost seems like God is rewarding bad behavior with that story, with that parable Jesus is telling, but that's not the point. It's not the point of the story at all. And that story in itself is radical and subversive because it insists that you don't need to do everything perfectly to still get that insanely controversial mercy and love and forgiveness from God. This idea that you can earn your forgiveness and earn God's mercy is something that people keep going back to time and time again, that God keeps saying that's not how it works. So when we talk about paradox, and we talk about rebelling against God, one thing we have to point out is the fact that God is rebellion. God rebels against our expectations, against what has been considered proper, right? Against what is considered truly divine. The things that he does, the way that he acts, the way his prophets come into being, the stories Jesus tells, and the story of Jesus himself, they are a rebellion against what this world considers powerful, righteous, good, and all these things, right? When this world is centering righteousness to mean the one who has the most power, the most wealth, the one who is clearly the most dignified on earth, God says, nope. In fact, the one who is the most stepped on, the most scorned, the most abandoned, that is the one who is truly holy, right? Blessed are the meek, blessed are the, oppressed, blessed are all these people who are just left behind. So says God, so says Jesus. That's why God is rebellion. So what does it mean to rebel against rebellion? It means to do what unfortunately many Christians are doing right now, which is holding up the status quo. To rebel against that rebellion, to rebel against that paradoxical nature of one's own religion, is to rebel against the transformative qualities of it and to rebel against the ability to make progress. The entire point of this religion, over thousands of years, is to show people the way forward, to constantly make progress, right? So when you have Christians saying that they need to avoid a secular world by upholding the status quo that, an otherwise non-secular world has been holding up this whole time, right? This very, heteronormative, cisnormative, and especially in America and in the West, white-centered world, to hold that up is to hold up the status quo, is to directly rebel against the God that would insist we destroy these earthly structures and institutions and move forward. And that's why the more you study and the more you learn about this stuff, the more obvious it is that modern day Christians with their purity culture, with their giant megachurches, with their insane quickness to judge people for not following every single rule that a church congregation has for them. It's so weird to see the fact that they are the ones who are upholding institutions that Jesus spoke against. This whole purity culture thing in and of itself, this whole, like, you know, purity balls where you promise your frickin' virginity to your dad until you get married, is not reminiscent of anything Christian, but it's in fact reminiscent of pre-Christian Roman traditions, ones that Saint Thecla from the apocryphal Acts of Paul and Thecla was talking about and warning against, was breaking down in her journey with Paul. So the fact that Christians today are still acting like a father has just kind of ownership over a daughter's body is hilariously, ironically, very, very anti-Christian, very, in fact, kind of Roman pagan, which is really funny. And that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about when I'm saying rebellion against God is rebellion against progressivism, rebellion against rebellion. It's rebellion that means I'm not going to progress, I'm not going to change, I'm not going to undo my own, ego and all these other things to push us forward because the way things are now services me, right? Paul says himself, there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither male nor female, neither slave nor free. In later verses, the neither male nor female part will get removed. Why? Because for some reason, some people could not handle that kind of paradox, that kind of affront to the status quo. And it's one that people are still trying to wrestle with today. As a paradoxical religion, this religion teaches us that money doesn't mean anything. That political power, physical power, military power, any kind of power you can have on earth is not power at all. It teaches us that, in fact, the only law that ever mattered was the law of love. And if you distract yourself and delude yourself by thinking that these 1,000,002 tiny little detail rules are what really matters, you miss the entire point. It's a religion where our high priest, our God the Son, is not some great high and mighty figure, but is one that came to serve, not to be served, but to serve. That he is, in fact, the child of some poor craftsman from a very poor little dumpy town, and not, in fact, some great hero from some great lineage from some great and wealthy town. Everything about Jesus' story and the things he says breaks convention and flies in the face of all expectations of this great kingly heroic figure everyone always thought the Messiah would be. And that's how you can tell immediately when you're, as a Christian witch, when you're dealing with someone who gets it or not, by the way they react to the title Christian witch. There are so many people who really want to stay in those very old systems of power, those institutions and structures that make them comfortable, without realizing that they are falling into the very trap that God sets for people time and time again. And that trap is to see if people can realize the value of humanity past all of these institutions. Can you recognize the humanity of a slave, of someone of a different gender or a different sexuality or a different, gender journey, basically, when we're talking about like trans people and stuff? Can you recognize the humanity in prisoners? Can you recognize the humanity in foreigners? How about the humanity of sinners and tax collectors and all these other things? This is what the gospel story, and really the entire Bible, is trying to push us to do again and again. This is what God keeps trying to show us, and that's why this is a God of paradox and rebellion against our own ego and our own understanding of power. You can't serve this God and serve those things, right? This is why Jesus says directly in Matthew 6:24, you cannot serve God and money. Money not just in the terms of like a coin, money in terms of all the things it represents, right? Power, luxury, comfort at the expense of other people, resource hoarding at the expense of other people. Come on, babe. You can't do that, because to follow God means to recognize that all these things that we distract ourselves with, the way children distract themselves with shiny toys, is not the point of our existence, is not the thing God's trying to bring us to or show us or teach us. They are distractions. They are counterfeits of true power and wealth and glory. And true power and wealth and glory stems from that love for God and one another. God himself being that rebellion against all that is unjust, against the status quo, against ego. God being love itself, right? And that is, in fact, why the Christian witch is so perfectly suited for this time. And this time when witchcraft is coming back up in the public eye when there seems to be this dichotomy, right, between, you know, not Jew and Greek, but Christian and witch. It's time to kind of point out the fact that there is neither Christian nor witch in Christ Jesus. There is neither of these things. There's none of these things. These are yet more divisions and more silly things that continue to separate people and distract them from what is really important. And that's why this entire title, when you decide to wear it, is in of itself a screening tool. The best magical tool you've got is literally just this title, because it screens people immediately. It's like holding up a holy amulet to a demon. You know there's a demon there if they start freaking the fuck out about it. Likewise with the title of Christian witch, you know you're dealing with the Christian who doesn't get it and is blinded by their own hubris by the way they react to that title. You know people just don't get it, just like Jesus says when there are some people who don't have eyes to see and don't have ears to hear. There are just some people who won't get it because they are too distracted by the counterfeit glories of this world. They're too assured of their own ego, of their own self-importance, to see the forest for the trees. And so I just wanted to put this idea out here. I wanted to talk about this and give y'all something to think about this weekend, especially for folks watching on Patreon as we go into Good Friday today. So it's as good a time as any to ask yourself, when you follow in God's ways, are you following these little details? Are you following these things to the letter? Are you getting wrapped up in, you know, the forest and the trees, can't see the forest? Or are you instead maybe risking persecution because you're willing to stare down the barrel of unjust governments, powerful institutions of racism and sexism and all these other things, and so on and so forth? Because it is much more dangerous and much more easy to be persecuted by the powers that actually systemically oppress people than it is to say you're oppressed because people in the comment section told you not to call people slurs. As Jesus himself says, those who have eyes to see will see, those who have ears to hear will hear. Belak will continue to be evil. And all that aside, I do hope you have a great week, that you have a good Easter, that you had a good Easter, and I'll see you next time.